Photoshop, in my opinion, is a digital photographer's dream come true. It's a photographer's dream come true. Now, while I'm rambling on here, you might want to open up Dodge and Burn Test. I already have it open, and it's in your exercise file for this chapter. Now, you take Photoshop and you combine it with programs like Lightroom, which are awesome, both of them, and you've got a digital darkroom. I more or less grew up working in darkrooms. I have a very traditional background in photography and film. And Photoshop actually was designed by a lot of people who are traditional photographers. So some of the tools in Photoshop emulate the tools that we use in a darkroom. Kind of interesting. The ones I'm talking about, the ones we're going to look at in this chapter, are right over here. And there's three of them. There's a Dodge tool, there's a Burn tool, and a Sponge tool. The purpose of the Dodge tool is to lighten areas of an image up very selectively. Use a paintbrush, we'll do it, and you'll lighten them up as you move. The Burn tool does the opposite, it darkens them, and the Sponge tool, well, basically it will add or subtract saturated colors, including vibrance, if you want it, to an image. But look at the tools themselves real quick here. The Dodge tool looks like a lollipop, I suppose. And the Burn tool looks like a hand that the index and thumb are making a circle, and the Sponge tool, well, looks like a sponge. In the darkroom, we used to take pieces of cardboard in a circle and put them on, actually used to, we still do, and put that on the end of a coat hanger. And when we were projecting the light through the enlarger onto the paper, we'd interject that Dodge tool in between the light source and the paper, which would give it less light, and it would lighten areas up. It was a real art form to do this. The Burn tool, take your hand, you make that little circle with the index and forefinger, you put that between the light source, block the light with the back of your hand, and burn through the hole to darken an area up. The Sponge tool, we used to use chemicals on a sponge to either increase or decrease the saturation colors in the image. And I keep saying used to, we still do. Let's look at these tools in my little test up here to give you, well, an idea of how they work. Let's start with the Dodge tool. Now, the Dodge tool has options up here. You can go from highlights to midtones to shadows in your dodging. Remember, dodging is lightning. And we have an exposure setting that goes from 1 to 100 in terms of percentage. Now, anytime you see the word exposure, what it means is it will lighten or darken, in our case, an area 50%, but that's the maximum it will go to. Now, you have an option here to protect tones. We'll leave that on. These two buttons right here, if you use a drawing tablet, can help you work with the drawing tablet. So let's come down here. I've got that set to midtones, don't forget. I'm going to get right about here, which is midtone on a gradient. And I'm going to hold the Shift key down because that'll make sure I draw straight lines. Okay, that's the only reason I'm holding the Shift key down. Now I'm going to start dragging. And you'll notice as I go back and forth, it is concentrating mostly in the middle area of that gradient that's midtone. So think of the midtones on a photograph. But you'll notice it's not getting any worse, or I should say any lighter, maybe not worse, because I said 50% exposure, and that's what it took it down to, but it won't do any more until I let go of the mouse and then do it again, and then it will give me another 50% if that's what I want. If we come back up here again and change that into shadows, we'll come down right about here, start in the same place, and you'll notice it's giving me more control over the shadow areas, but it's totally ignoring the highlights over here, even if I come over here and move it over those areas over and over again. The next one, highlights. Let's come down to about here. As you can see, it's really impacting the highlights. It's doing nothing in the shadow areas once it gets past that midtone. So you can control what areas you're lightening and darkening. Now the Burn tool, I'll just do one, does the same thing, except it darkens instead of lightens. So if we put this on midtones, leave everything else alone, nothing else is different up here, you get the same options, and it will darken. So think of an image, and we'll do this in this lesson, that's got some areas that are a little bit too dark, maybe a little bit too light, and it's not the whole image, it's just an area. Good tool to have. The next one down, the last one actually, is called the Sponge. Now in the Sponge tool, you have a saturate and a desaturate option. Do you want to increase the saturation? Saturation is purity, incidentally. Do Do you want to increase the saturation of the colors, or do you want to desaturate them and take this thing down, say, to shades of gray? Now let's do this. Our flow is at 100%. You say, well, it doesn't say exposure anymore. You're right. Flow is different. What flow means is constant. The more I rub, the more it does. And this is just how fast it does it. I've got it at 100. The default's 50, so we can see things happening faster. And we do have an option to maintain the vibrancy of the color. So let me show you the difference. Let me go ahead and turn that on. We'll come over here and go into desaturate. If I come over to about here, again, I'm going to hold the shift key down, you will notice it begins taking some of those areas down into, well, not really shades of gray, but it's reducing the saturation of the colors. But you see, we have the word vibrance selected, and that means that it's going to maintain the vibrancy of the color. Colors that have much more saturation, like here and here, as you can see, no matter how much I rub, it's not really getting rid of a lot of the color because I've got vibrance on. But if I come over here and turn that off, come down to about here and do the same thing again, now it's going to keep doing it until the color is completely removed because I've turned off vibrance. Now as for this one, saturate, it does the opposite. It increases the saturation of the colors until I get to a pure color. Now these areas here are pretty much pure, but if I get about here and begin doing this, you'll see that some of the areas in the yellows and in these bright oranges and even over here in these blue purples doesn't change because they're already just about at 100% saturation. So we can lighten areas, dodge, we can darken areas, burn, and we can increase or decrease the color of the image in very selective paintbrush kind of ways using the dodge, the burn, and the sponge tools. On to the next.